Hi, everyone. I too am honored to be here, and I want to thank Laura for inviting me. I will tell you, though, it's a very strange feeling to be of an age where your firsthand knowledge now is valued for its historical content. I'm not sure I like that, but anyway. So today I'm going to talk about mainly three things, and I hope my talk at first will kind of enliven your sense of Alexander Gerard as a person, and the acquisition of the Gerard collection and some of the history there, and some of the personalities involved. Then I would like to look at Mr. Gerard's working methods, because I think they're incredibly interesting and not well known, and some of the strategies that he used to engage visitors that are not perhaps all that obvious to the occasional viewer. And then lastly, some of the curatorial challenges that we faced and solved or didn't solve or whatever. So this is my very favorite picture of Sandro. I think you can tell so much about him here. This was taken for the book, so it was after he had already left it was taken for its Spirit of Folk Art. It was after he had already left the museum. As you can see, he was a very amiable and sophisticated man. He always wore an ascot like that and was very impeccably dressed. He was well-spoken. He was mild-mannered. He was kind. But he was also impish and mischievous. And this is the part of Sandro that I have to say I loved also. My first encounter, if you will, with Alexander Gerard it was through his work. It wasn't when I was here in Santa Fe. And it's kind of an amazing thing. I was 16 years old. I went on a first date. I grew up outside of New York City. And I was taken to see the movie Cleopatra, the one with Elizabeth Taylor, and then taken to dinner at where? La Fonda del Sol. It was amazing. And I have to tell you that the fresh-faced boy who took me on that deck, I don't remember one word he said. I remember everything about La Fonda del Sol. I mean, it made just a huge impression. The liveliness of it, the color, I'd never been in a place that was so, designed for a sense of fun and vitality and life. And it really, really made a huge impression upon me. The open kitchen, the graphics. I mean, I could go on and on about it. So little did I know that years later, after graduate school, after college, then I would begin to work with Sandro, but I did. Here's a little anecdote that I think is cute that talked about how our relationship developed and really the relationship with other members of the staff as well. We had an arrangement, I think Susan negotiated it actually. Because Sandro, either he never did drive or he didn't drive at that time. I wasn't clear. The family would know, of course. But we would pick him up, this is for 3 years, every day in the morning after breakfast, bring him to the museum, take him home for lunch, pick him up after lunch, bring him here, and then take him back home. And the home was only a mile away, so this wasn't like a burden or anything. But it did give us just that little bit of time, each of us, to get to know him on a more personal basis. Because when he worked in the gallery, which he did every day for 3 years, pro bono, I might add, he was very focused. He really was. And we would fool around some, but the truth was he was very focused. So I remember just on one trip, I was about to take him home. He said, "Could we go to Kmart?" So I thought, sure. I mean, I'm not going to say no. By the way, I will call him Sandro here, but he was never Sandro to us in the museum. He was always Mr. Gerard. So as soon as we stopped and got out of the car, he made a beeline for the toy department, of course. And I remember exactly what he bought. He bought a green chimpanzee or ape of some sort that was about that big, and you could pull on the arms and stretch them out. And then he bought a bird cage into which he put the ape. And then he also bought some little, as if you were a kid having a little grocery store, Brillo boxes and things like that. I was talking to Barbara Malden. She said, "I think I remember cataloging those Brillo boxes." But why was this important? It was important because something happened to me that day. I got to experience him in collecting mode, which I hadn't otherwise seen. And I realized here is a man who was so deeply visual, so unencumbered by blinders, which curators do wear. We see things through all kinds of filters, that he could just encounter the world and come away with something that had some meaning to him. And he would find the whole world as a source of inspiration. So I thought that was a very important lesson for me. I'll spend a little time on this slide, which was kind of had some important people in it. So to the left was is the late George Ewing. He died not too long ago. He was director of the Museum of New Mexico. Second is Dr. Yvonne Lange, who I'll speak about in a little bit in depth. Dorothy Woolley, who was president then of the Folk Art Foundation, the single most important entity in the history of this museum. Miss O'Keeffe, and then of course Susan and Sandro. And I want to say that if there was any person who was a hero in this entire project, aside from our wonderfully generous donors, it was Yvonne Lange. And Yvonne had an interesting history. She was raised in Trinidad on a sugar plantation in a wealthy family. She was multilingual. She was a pilot in the very early days of women flying. She worked for a high-level circum-Caribbean kind of diplomatic organization. And she left all of that to go back to graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania to get a degree in folklore. And then she was hired here. I don't know who thought to hire her, but it was the single most brilliant stroke. Because while this museum had sort of taken off at the very beginning, it kind of coasted for a while, and we had, a series of different directors. And in my view, it wasn't until Dr. Lange took the helm that we really, really saw this place move from kind of a slightly backwater museum into one that was catapulted into national prominence, mainly through the acquisition of the Girard collection. So Yvonne arrived here like in 1971. It was very timely because that was right at the time that Sandro was doing his last collection for Herman Miller. And I am sure he was thinking about what the future would hold from him. Within 2 months of her arrival, she heard about this collection, and she actually had a meeting with the Girards. She was an indefatigable leader. We were all very loyal to her. She built her own team. And I have to say, she doggedly pursued this gift. Had someone come in and do a feasibility study. Then there were these test exhibits you heard about. Then she had the most prominent cultural planning firm come in and do a master plan. And then there was the drafting of the gift agreement, and then finally raising the needed funds to build the building. And she made that all a reality. Sadly, somehow her relationship with the Girards just never really took. And I knew them both, and I knew they would have loved each other, but it was a kind of formality in the relationship that somehow was never surpassed. Richard Grove, in his feasibility study, said something I want to quote, and he said, "During negotiations, collectors have been known to become moody, guarded, cautious, and distrustful because they are to be bereft of a part of their lives, while museums appear at their crankiest and creakiest and most bureaucratic because they fear being strangled by ill-advised restrictions, and thus they insist upon looking a gift horse squarely in the mouth." And that is what happened, I will say that. One serious part of the gift agreement negotiations were a huge concession made by the Girards, actually, after much talking. And when I saw this in the Vitra book, I was amazed because there it is, the Museum of Toys. And that is exactly what Sandro had in mind. Joachim mentions in his essay that Sandro did an inventory of the collection. It was 80,000 toys and I think 18,000 what were called properties. And that solved this mystery for me because we never understood how there were these things called props. I mean, they consisted of extremely important things. For example, the Marshall Cutler sampler collection was in a box called props, right? But it was because the collection started out being a toy collection. And I do believe that for Sandro to give up that idea of a museum of toys was a major one. She said that the museum, Yvonne did, held firm in not wanting to have its focus severely limited to that of a toy museum or to have its scope restricted. And in this case, the museum's wishes held sway. Meanwhile, of course, there was a building addition to be designed and built. You heard a little bit about that. Paul Winkler was he was our assistant director, the primary contact, and he helped shepherd through the selection of Harvey Hoschauer, who was an Albuquerque-based architect who had worked for Mies van der Rohe and also Gerard at one point. And Sandro really was the client for the state building, which if you think about it now, that's rather remarkable. And he had a mandate, a very clear mandate, maximum space to fit within the budget. An open gallery with no columns or other really prominent noticeable architectural elements except for the ceiling structure. And then below the gallery, an equal-sized space to house the collection. Basically, I think he believed that the folk art would carry the day, which of course it does. Someone asked earlier about, did we know what we were getting into? Yes and no would be the answer to that. This was shortly before the gift agreement was signed in 1978, and this is this room, thankfully renovated at last, with these boxes in it. And there were 4,200 of those boxes, plus many, many crates, like hundreds of large crates. That collection quintupled the size of the collection that we had acquired as a full museum for the first 25 years of our existence. So when I say it catapulted us into being well known, I really mean that. And at this point then, when the things arrived, the building was yet to be built, or the addition, but we did begin the processing. And this just astonished me. I think this really worthy of note that we were given these catalog sheets by the Gerard Foundation and that they were ever created, because this was a privately held collection, and yet Sandro, and many of these are in his own handwriting, took the time, every single beer box, this is beer box 93, right? I didn't have that sheet, unfortunately, would list what the origin or provenance was as best he knew, and he knew a lot. He knew where he had acquired these things, and then every single thing that was in there. So these were the basis for our catalog, of course, with the curators lending their knowledge so that our volunteer staff could do this. It was a labor of love on Sandro's part, and I think it was very impressive. These were then put into a very early computer-based system, and we had a whole cadre of volunteers that were writing up sheets and entering data, et cetera. I wanted to show these two slides because on the bottom right are some of the over 30 volunteers who worked. These volunteers were sewing and mounting samplers that could be shown. And this was a great day where we had a whole delegation of elders we had invited from Cochiti Pueblo to help us identify who were the makers of the very large, ceramic collection, a figurative collection that we had. So we were a curatorial staff of 5, a volunteer team of 20, and then no collections management staff. So at first we started opening these boxes, and it was like Christmas every morning. I mean, it was amazing. We were uncovering the most beautiful things we didn't have in the collection. But as time wore on, I'm going to tell you, it felt a little bit like that movie Groundhog Day. I mean, this went on for 5 years. It was hard. It became tedious and tiring, and we were all mid-career curators or beginning even curators, and we had shows we wanted to do and books we wanted to write and things like curators want to do, and it was really put on hold for the most part during this period. One beautiful thing though was to see Sandro, because he would come back there. His joy at seeing the collection was just palpable because it had been packed up in the house for so many years, so that was really a beautiful thing. I was thinking about it recently, and I realized there were about 50 people who, you saw the slide before, and actually we took it out of Croissant's talk, so it's a popular slide. And I think that, you heard about what kind of talent and work goes into this, so I won't go into that further. But I want to say one person who is not pictured here is Doc Davis, and he was essential to the success of this. A very shy man. He had worked for Sandro previously, and then our exhibitions department hired him as a fabricator, and he really became Sandro's right-hand man. And many of the things you see in the gallery were worked out in conversation between Doc Davis and him. I want to be sure everyone really does realize the degree of personal dedication that Sandro had to this task, because this was every day. He was here every day and overseeing the whole process. He was just deeply engaged in every aspect of the installation. One kind of nice thing that happened is during the installation, we started having some prominent visitors come, just to see it. One, of course, was Miss O'Keeffe, but also Deanna Vreeland came. She was the editor of Vogue magazine. She appeared wearing all black, very predictably. And then Andy Warhol came. That was probably the best one. Andy Warhol had a fantastic idea. So he was in there when most of the things were already set up. And he declared that we shouldn't put that glass up. It wasn't the folk art that was hurting anybody, it was the visitors. So what we really needed was a glass tunnel for the visitors to go through. I really kind of rather liked that idea, actually. And then also, after the wing opened, Queen Sofia and King Juan Carlos came from Spain, and they were very interested in the bullfight scene. And they kind of gently told us that our picadors were not doing the right thing. They were in the wrong position. So we quickly readied that. All right, so I put this in here so you would realize how long ago, that's me, when I was 28, how long ago this really was. It was very much an analog age. And I was 28 and had already been working for the museum for 3 years, right around the time this picture was taken. I want to say that Susan and Sandro were very kind to me. They invited my then husband and me to dinner at their home, so I had the honor of seeing the house on the east side of Camino del Oro. They subsequently moved to the west side. I sort of remember a haze of straight vodka on the rocks. And then we went to the compound for dinner. So it was a very special thing that I, again, never forgot. While the wing was developing and after the construction was over, I was appointed to be the curatorial coordinator, which meant that my role would be to provide Mr. Gerard with whatever he needed for his work on the installation and to be involved in curatorial matters as they surfaced. The gallery guide was probably the most major interpretive part, and you've heard about some of it. One thing you haven't heard about, though, and I only learned this recently by reading a document, was that he actually had written a letter to Yvonne, thinking that perhaps quotes from the Bible or from famous individuals would make good labels. This was never communicated to me, but I thought that was a very interesting perspective. Sometimes my interactions with him were about museum protocols. So and this one became kind of a joke, but I call it the oh brother moments in our relationship. Mr. Gerard enjoyed his Benson and Hedges cigarettes sort of in the European manner. And so it became my job, because of course smoking was not permitted in the gallery, to ask him to please stub out the cigarette, to which he would always reply, "Oh, brother." And then the minute I was out of sight, he would light another one. But it was kind of a fun thing, and you'll hear about a couple more here if I can get through all this. As you can imagine, not every single issue could have been tackled in the gift agreement or even thought through. So it fell to me and the rest of the staff sometimes to work out the kinks and the details as we went along. And very occasionally, a really truly important question would surface, and there was no answer to it. And everybody was sort of scared to ask. this question. And the question was, how long do you expect the exhibition to be in place? And this was a deeply interesting question to our conservation people and, of course, to the curators. So one day, it was a quiet day, so I just decided to pop the question. And the conversation went like this. Mr. Gerard, I wonder how long you imagine this exhibition we're working on will be up? And he said, well, he said, Charlene, have you ever been to Florence? I had to admit that I had not yet been to Florence. And he said, well, my very favorite museum in the whole world is there, and it's called La Specola, and it's a natural history museum. And he said, picture this, you walk into this room, he was very descriptive about this, and there's a case, and in that case is the body of a beautiful woman with her hair flowing next to her. And as you approach the case, you realize she's made of wax, and her insides are exposed because this is an anatomical exhibition. It is truly great. And do you know when that exhibition was installed? I went, no. 1780. So, you know, we did find out, and this made me, when I was thinking about this recently, and I saw this picture again, because I have since been to La Specola, as you can be sure, you know, he knew he was working on a great masterwork at the end of his career. This was the last thing he did, and I think that's important to kind of recognize when we talk about changes to the exhibit or any of those things. Another interesting aspect of this whole thing was the actual installation process and the design process. So it was, I'll be honest with you, it was very unexpected. There were and there would not be any drawings for this exhibition design. So picture this, you've got 10,000 square feet, there are no drawings. And actually, after seeing the Vitra exhibit, I really understand what a hands-on approach Sandro took to designing things. So these boxes were by now empty, you see. So he would stack them up just like this and say, okay, Doc, and he would have a lot, like picture the size of that whole Mexican village, right? After he got it to be the size that he thought would work, then he would have Doc make a pedestal base out of birch plywood. That would be that size. Then we would move forward to, we called them bump outs. But then he would put styrofoam like sheets, chunks of it, and stack those up so that you would begin to see how the figures would then be arrayed within that bump out. So one of my jobs, along with designer Joe Chipman, was to work with Sandro in storage and have him, we hoped, select the pieces he'd like us to bring upstairs. Occasionally he would say, I need to see all of India. It's like, really? It's like, okay, you know, we did it. So there would be tables, folding tables with all of the pieces. And then he would often lovingly himself place those pieces in the dioramas. One quality, I want to say that he referred to these as habitats, as you heard, or sets, but he also referred to those figures as people. And I never once heard him ever use the word miniature, I will tell you. He felt that the sets were needed to give a life to these folk figures and that he didn't want people to be bored. He just would see people kind of with blank expressions as they would go down a traditional sort of museum exhibition. So one way to bring these alive was to cover the bases of all these objects with sand. So as you can see, it kind of unifies the whole thing and then also really does make them feel like the multitudes, or what Henry Glassey characterized as the noisy crowd. It was also very instructive to see how he layered things. You know, he would have, this one is not a good example, neither is this, but anyway, he would have the museum staff go out and pick chamisa plants, and then they would, you know, form them into tree shapes, and then they would be treated with fire retardant so they could be used in the exhibit. But that was how you can't have a village without a tree, can you? So he would do that. Also, to create a sense of place, he would have interiors where it had wallpaper, tile, furnishing, lighting, candlesticks. I mean, I would always think he's done, and then he would have more days of work to keep layering it on. I guess you could say that, or you could argue, the primary approach to the gallery was characterized by a kind of horreur vacui. But that was highly intentional on his part because he always said, he said to me anyway, I want people to have a reason to come back here so that they will see something new each time. And I know he accomplished that because I'm still seeing things that are new when I go into that gallery. After the sets came these niches, and sometimes they were highly intentional, other times he would just be an empty space and he'd want to put something in there. Henry Glassie made what I think is an interesting observation, and for any of you who really want to see what Sandro's thinking was, the very first chapter of The Spirit of Folk Art recreates his tour with Sandro before he started to write the book. And it's very, very instructive. One thing Henry Glassie noticed was or in his mind at least, if it was a culture with which Sandro did not have deep familiarity, as he did, for example, with Mexico or much of Latin America or India even, he would do these more sort of abstracted, frontal types of, installations. I don't know if I buy that, but I do think it's a kind of an interesting theory. Next, I'd like to talk just a tiny bit about how Sandro used various strategies to engage people. He would mainly he would charm audiences and still does through his sense of humor, I think, but he even planted kind of Easter eggs for people who were careful observers. There would be things you wouldn't have seen otherwise. So here, for example, is the Last Supper, and I want to show you, see if I can make this thing work. Yeah, so see this dog? It's a little hard to see, actually. That dog is peeing in a chamber pot. And really, I would encourage you to go in there and just stare at those sets because there are more of those things going on. Another one that I've often shown people in tours was this set, which if you really get into it, again, so there's a cockfight going on. It's called The Cockfight in the gallery guide. But then you notice, it's a butcher shop and it's open and people are upstairs on the esplanade or whatever. Oh, and then there's the couple. And it looks like they're nude behind that sheet, right? So suddenly he has, his wit has involved you, like, what were they doing? And, you're part of that scene. And I think that was a very ingenious way to get people involved. I might add that those two figures are Adam and Eve figures from Ocatlan, but when Sandro saw them, he literally saw them in a different way. Other very clever strategies were where he would use perspective, or fake perspective, really, by putting little tiny figures in the back and then larger ones in the front so that it suggested a great distance, even though, in fact, it wasn't. Or in this toy shop, what I call the peekaboo. He would let you look out into another place, like this street. So it's as if you really are in what I always consider to be his dream toy shop. Even the number on the toy shop is in reverse, so you can see it from the street. Or he would do like such a simple detail. I've always been very moved by this one, and others have mentioned it already today, but this wake scene, the single hanging light bulb, that is no longer Mexico today in most places. But, it harkens back to a time, and I don't know, the universality of losing someone you love, I think is so beautifully and humbly expressed in that. And so, this joy and this joking and the visual puns that I didn't even show you all over the place, Sandro invites us to be a part of that with him. So it's very personal. And when we didn't have any information about Sandro outside the gallery, people still understood that there's a mind, there's an intellect, there's creativity, there's a single vision, behind this gallery. And that was very clear. Kind of less fun are what I call curatorial pokes. And I never knew if he was doing this on purpose, actually. So this is the chapel. Many of you have seen it. It's the only roof structure in the gallery. And you may not know it, but each one of those walls is characterized by the color of the object. So this one on the left here is what's called the red wall, because it had mainly red things in it. So I walked in one day, and I was reviewing all the different walls with him, and I saw that very red dog was right underneath that Virgin. So I'm the curator, right? I go, Mr. Gerard, I don't think that red dog can stay in the chapel. Him, why not? Well, it's a dog, and everything else in the chapel is a devotional object, and, you know, a dog doesn't belong in there, and, you know, a dog is not sacred. So he says, I guess that depends how you feel about dogs. But he did take it out. But, you know, every time there was a poke, it made me think, well, what are the curatorial categories I'm carrying around in my head, and whose are they? And do they matter to the public? And who do they serve? And then who am I to have them, you know? Oops, sorry, what did I do? Okay. Another one had to do with non-folk art in the gallery. So manufactured robots aren't folk art. Maybe all agree on that, maybe not, I don't even know. Anyway, I went in there the other day because there's not a photograph of these anywhere in the archive. And then I looked in the gallery guide, nothing. There's no number assigned to those. And I realized he had put those up at the very end, you know. Maybe he went to Kmart, you know, I don't know. But anyway, until I took the picture with my iPhone, there was no kind of documentation of those, and I don't know if they're cataloged. Then there were something I happen to love, which are the dog toys. It's kind of a mini micro collection within the collection. And you see the Pupsy Cola over here? Yeah. And then there's, on here is a newspaper. Over here is like a fake box of Marlboro cigarettes. But I never challenged the inclusion of these, not that I would have won anyway, but because, you know, this whole idea of what's real and what's not real was something that Sandro was very interested in. And that's why he collected all of these, you know, plates of food and that sort of thing. Plus, you know, it was fun. It was lighthearted. It was really in keeping with what the whole thing was about. And then I just want to embark upon a couple serious things that we did, and then I'll be finished. One of these involved a Monday hunter shirt. So on this memo from Nora Fisher shows that just before November 3rd of 1981, and remember we opened in December of 82, so many, many things were placed in that gallery already. We had someone come through who was a curator from Abidjan, Ivory Coast, as part of our International Visitors Program, which is very active here at our museum. The curator saw the shirt in the gallery, and I was there. He was horrified. There was just no other way to put it. And I really wish Mr. Gerard had been there, but he was at that particular moment. He told us that this shirt was so powerful that the hunter and shaman who would have owned it would have forbidden his son not only from touching it, but from even seeing it, that it would have been hidden away from his family. And he just stated unequivocally, that shirt cannot be exhibited among these toys. And he was quite agitated. So that's what resulted in Nora Fisher's memo. This is Yvonne's letter several months later. And I think it's worth knowing that 3 months later, she does talk about two things. One is that this problem with the shirt, because in this case, Mr. Gerard was not too interested in having it moved. He liked where it was, and I understood why. It has a monkey skull, as you can see, and he had it placed, and it was already there in the gallery above the Day of the Dead section. So to him, there was a kind of resonance between those two things. But as a result of this, the museum created what's still in existence today called the Sensitive Materials Committee and a policy on sensitive materials. And as a result, Yvonne also recognized how frustrating this was for Mr. Gerard, and he did allow us to take it down, unhappily, I will say. Then we did have one repatriation issue. That was one day I was there and volunteers were unpacking things, and they unpacked something and said, come over here. And they were Zuni war gods. I didn't know what they were, but I just knew there weren't something that I thought we should unpack. So we luckily had our colleagues at the lab, and they came and helped us understand that these were in fact Zuni war gods. And the thing about a Zuni war god is that it must be collectively owned. It cannot be privately owned, therefore it cannot be sold, therefore couldn't be in a private collection. And in this case, Mr. Gerard did go along with having those pieces repatriated to Zuni Pueblo. And there was a huge ceremony, and they were very happy to get them back. Again, Sandro's sense of humor, Susan and Sandro on the skull. So we ask ourselves now, like, what is the future of multiple visions, a common bond? Well, I have to tell you, first of all, that that title was not Sandro's invention. I'm sure his family would know that it would not be the kind of thing he would say. But we were getting really late in the game, and we needed to have a title, and it was not me, but another staff member thought of it, and so I told him about it. And when I said, you know, we're going to call it Multiple Visions, a common bond, Multiple Visions, he stopped, he looked at me with that oh brother look, and he said, "Sounds like an eye disease to me." Which I now have never been able to get that out of my head. Anyway, I think if Sandro were here today, he'd be very thrilled to see that we have, of course, cleaned and extensively cleaned the collection before, but under Kristan's leadership, we're doing a really major renovation with lighting and everything else, and it's just really looking beautiful. And I mean, clearly if we're doing that, there is no end in sight to Multiple Visions. So that makes me think perhaps the La Specola idea was, you know, not so far off, that this may now be, as it is increasingly regarded as one of his masterpieces, we will find ways to keep it in place. And it is indubitably the most popular thing in the museum, no matter how hard we may try to do other things. However, that said, this is no longer 1982. This is 2019. We went from an analog world to a digital world. So I think I applaud the museum in trying to think of other ways through apps or other, you know, technology to serve the needs of visitors, whether it's a game for children or more information, you know, without cluttering up the exhibit with anything more than those little numbers, which he didn't like those too much either, frankly. He once said to me that in an interview, which is a published interview, that he wanted to show our common humanity, basically, but without the bromide of one world, is what he called it. And, you know, whether he succeeded in that, I think, is a little bit debatable, and I'll tell you why. He enjoyed seeing not only the similarities, but the differences among those people, and they were people to him. But I have done more than 1,000 tours in that gallery, and I will tell you that what people get is the common, you know, common humanity idea. They catch the part that shows that we're all alike. Very few people catch on to the idea that there are a whole complexity of cultural choices, which you can see in that gallery. Kind of building on something we saw this morning, I did have one person say to me that, you know, we really need music in this gallery, and I think what you should put in there is, it's a small, small world. I was like, not something during my watch that was going to happen. So that's simply to say that, you know, we do need to look at, as attitudes and mores and our cultures change, and we understand power structures perhaps more clearly, or we begin to, that some of these things might require change. And I think we're going to hear more about that in the case studies that follow. But what I really do want to say is that I think what will inevitably persist is the joy that the Gerard collection brings to the vast majority of people. Well more than 1 million visitors now, with many more to come. And I think they do understand Sandro's vision, and especially his very palpable love for the art he collected. And that is what will live on. Thank you.